NATO is one of the most iconic organizations associated to the Cold War. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is often used by historians as a stand-in to represent the United States and its allies as one faction of the conflict. And it makes good sense. It's a military alliance founded directly because of a Soviet threat and contained many of the US's allies. We'll be talking about NATO a lot during this channel's lifetime, so it's about time we got to know it a little better. How did it get started? How does it work? I'm your host David, and today we are off to Brussels. This is the Cold War. We start in 1945. Yes, our starting point is the Second World War. Again. Western Europe was in a dire economic position. Their armies devastated, their economy decimated, their people, another word for messed up. Now, imagine you were a capitalist or capitalist sympathizer living in America or Western Europe at this moment. The region with the significant capitalist power was ravaged, and in some countries, like France or Italy, communism was on the rise. To the east was the Soviet Union, which, despite a weak start, wound up ending the Second World War as the absolute powerhouse on the continent, with a sizable part of Europe under its control. In the years following the war, the Soviets used this occupation to consolidate power and enforce communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe. As elderly baby and colonization enthusiast Winston Churchill described it, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere and are all subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow." That's the second time I've quoted that, almost like it's a defining moment or something. The shaky alliance of convenience between the Western capitalist powers and the USSR, set up to defeat Nazi Germany, was not only fraying at the edges, but it was also completely disintegrated. For case studies of this, you can go and check, well, pretty much every video we've produced so far. Now, we've already talked about the Marshall Plan, where the US pushed to rebuild the European economy, and covertly, or not so covertly, weaken communist support there. They did it by backing up a dump truck full of money and dumping it on the continent. Actually, it was more like several dump trucks full of money. But what we did not talk about yet on this channel was the project to rebuild the military of Europe. So, to talk about NATO, we need to talk about the Brussels Treaty. In 1948, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the UK got together to expand an existing military alliance between the UK and France to the Benelux countries, in case of renewed aggression from the USSR. It also founded the Western European Union, which would manage said alliance until its dissolution in 2010. This was good, but it became apparent very fast that even these countries would not be able to adequately handle military aggression if the Soviets mustered their entire sphere of influence against them. There would need to be a new military alliance to counter it that was much more robust. At the same time, discussions of a broader alliance between the US, UK, and Canada were already happening behind closed doors. The newly developed United Nations was already bogged down with Cold War politics. So they wanted to build something that would handle security issues and function as an alliance, but would be distinctly not part of the UN. This blossomed into the concept of a more extensive multilateral defense treaty in the wake of the 1948 communist coup in Czechoslovakia. The rest of the Brussels Treaty countries entered into the agreement, as well as Norway. The next year, they came up with the North Atlantic Treaty, or Washington Treaty. It came at the end of months of secret negotiations between member states meeting in the Pentagon. The treaty founded NATO, with its founding nations consisting of Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Okay, so NATO's now a thing. But what was NATO? What does being a NATO member mean exactly? The North Atlantic Treaty had 14 articles, which member nations had to agree to. They couldn't go to war with each other, they had to promote democratic institutions and economic collaboration, they had to resist the desire to invade other countries, and had to respect each other's territory and autonomy. They also agreed to Article 5, which, if you've heard of any of the articles, it's likely this one that you've heard of. Article 5 is the Mutual Defense Pact. It states that an attack on one of these member countries will be considered an attack on all member nations. It's this part of the treaty in particular which has put the world on the razor's edge on a few occasions, and actually still does to this day. Fun fact though, Article 5, as a threat, has done way more than its actual use. Only one time in the entire history of NATO has Article 5 been cited as a casus belli for war, and it was in response to the attacks of September 11th, 2001, so not even during the Cold War this channel is focused on. This agreement didn't seem to do much for a little while. Early NATO didn't make any significant plans for military cooperation until the Korean War. The logistics of a big international military conflict against a more coordinated global communist effort required them to put in the legwork to make NATO actually function as they envisioned. That meant forming new governing bodies and military organizations. One of the first projects was to appoint a supreme commander in Europe, a man with experience in the role already, General Dwight David Eisenhower. But don't worry about remembering his name, you'll probably never see it again. There was also a governing body founded called the North Atlantic Council, where member states could discuss security issues. The leader of the council would serve as the top civilian leader, while the supreme commander would be the top military one. Their main projects were to outline how these different militaries would work together and coordinate efforts during a potential war. Each country must also keep military spending above a certain percentage of GDP, and they must all contribute to running the organization. NATO also encouraged for cooperation and standardization of the so-called little things of war. They standardized the obvious stuff like making sure they all use the same caliber of bullets. They standardized the less obvious stuff like making sure they use the same terminology. They'd organize coordinated war games and drilling exercises, both on land and at sea, to prepare for the event of a Soviet attack. NATO is even responsible for the phonetic alphabet. You know, whiskey, tango, foxtrot type of stuff you hear in war movies. The military problem NATO had on the ground, though, was that their military was diminutive. The Soviets just had way more soldiers and an overall more massive military by comparison. But there was one ace up NATO's sleeve that they'd lean on the whole Cold War period: nuclear weapons. The NATO strategy was, in the face of having fewer troops, to maintain atomic and nuclear supremacy. Many NATO members had nuclear arsenals and tried to maintain supremacy in the missile gap between them and the USSR. The Soviets noticed right away that this organization was an alliance in direct opposition to them. To be honest, this mentality continues to this day, with the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin still seeing NATO as a geopolitical adversary to Russian interests. Probably because that's precisely what it was, and sort of still is. But anyway, in reaction to NATO's formation, in 1955, the USSR and several of its communist satellite states started their own military alliance, with blackjack and hookers. I'd love to talk more about the Warsaw Pact, and in fact, I'm going to get into a lot about it, but it's on the schedule for a future video, and if I talk about it now, Nolan will yell at me. NATO would continue to function through the entire Cold War period and into the present as one of the world's most powerful military forces. Soon after its founding, countries in more precarious situations with the USSR, like Greece, Turkey, and even West Germany, would become members. This would box in and limit or prevent opportunities for the USSR to offer military defense to those countries and could also help stop the creation of communist movements there. Today, NATO contains 70% of the world's military spending and includes 29 member nations, including several former Warsaw Pact states. Long after the end of the Cold War, NATO still functions and exerts power across the globe. In fact, many people ask why it's still around, to which their explanation is for another channel to give because I'm not touching that one. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. My thanks to Tristan at Step Back History for today's script. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you want to ensure we're able to keep the lights on in our studio, please consider supporting us via Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.